light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Hu. Today I wanted to offer a few reflections on the topic of validation. On rare occasions, people have suggested that I dress up in order to get attention, which is not the case at all. Being Sister Hu is all about symbolism and metaphor, using my attire, my very appearance, to illustrate deeper ideas that are very difficult to portray in literal fashion. Because, how does one portray love? Well, there's a million different ways you could portray love, but there is nothing that verifiably portrays love, because love is not a concrete thing that can be touched or seen or heard. It's something, it's an idea, an emotion, a principle, a behavior. It's all sorts of things that can manifest in 1,000 different ways, but none of those ways will tell you everything there is to know about love. By its very nature, it is an invisible spiritual reality. And yet we need to learn about it, we need to be able to express it, we need to be able to share it, and consequently we have to come up with things that somehow stand in for love in a way that our physical bodies and physical senses can interact with. In a similar sort of way, there is this phenomena of validation that is wonderful. It feels good, I suppose, but for me as Sister Hu, it should never be the reason that I do things. If it's there, great. If it's not, oh well. The reason for being Sister Hu is to nurture others' personal and spiritual growth using symbol and metaphor. It's a very serious ministry. It's not a satire or a spoof or a put down of anybody. It's a way of trying to educate, trying to be a bridge between the invisible world and the visible world. When it comes to validation, in one sense, validation is not important, because I really do believe that I need to have much better reasons than just somebody's approval or compliment for doing the things that I do. On the other hand, validation is important in the sense of not necessarily validation meaning you did well, but validation in the sense of feedback, validation in the sense of response, of acknowledging that I'm here. By whatever specific kind of validation or the words that the validation chooses, I can learn how it is that I'm coming across. For some people, I may be coming across in a very challenging fashion. For other people, it may be very inspirational, very refreshing. I had one person who smiled and approached me once and said that Catholic school would have been a very different experience for him if the nuns had dressed as Sister Hu does instead of in more traditional forms. An amusing thing to consider. There would have certainly been all sorts of different implications, but I don't know that any of the Catholic school teachers would have wanted to spend 3 hours putting on makeup before class. It's a bit much to undertake in that sort of daily, as a daily ritual. 3 hours of preparation would be a bit too unwieldy. But the point of coming to that validation, on one hand, I need to know within myself that I am acting truthfully according to myself, that I'm acting in a way that is consistent with who and what I am. So often, and for lots of logical but questionable reasons, people will act different than who they are or what they are in order to get some sort of particular response from a particular person or group of people or entity. people may act a certain way for an employer, for example, because they want to secure a position of employment, they want a paycheck, they want different sorts of empowering responses from the people with whom they spend their days so that they can earn a living to pay bills and provide a house for themselves and their family and so forth. The people who are most happy in their jobs, I find, are those who have been able to create a profession, a way of earning income that is most congruent with who and what they are. When you can put what you love with what you need to do to survive and weave the two together, it makes for a much more recommendable way of spending your life. We only have so many time, as one songwriter put it, so many trips around the sun. We only have so many years of life. These bodies were not designed to be immortal. Our spirits may go on, but our bodies do not. They were never intended to. That being the case, it makes sense to use the time that we have here as wisely and as well as possible. Validation, positive or negative, because you can have negative validation also, letting you know when things are a little off course, letting you know when something was not understood, letting you know when improvement is needed. Those things are validation also, and I suppose especially so because the person who tells you where improvement is needed is clearly someone who cares about you. Whether they intend to or not, whether they say they don't like you, the fact that they're giving you helpful information is a sort of compliment. They care about your development, about which way your life is going, and about how well you will do the next time around. They want you to improve and to be even better than you have been. So I appreciate honest feedback, and I appreciate the validation because it lets me know how I'm coming across or what I need to vary a little bit because things are a little bit off course, or I suppose it's similar to tuning an instrument, and unless you have the validation that when you pluck the string, you hear the vibration, and the vibration, the sound coming from the instrument validates that you did in fact pluck the string. If you pluck the string and you don't hear anything, it makes you wonder, did I not pluck it hard enough? Is there something wrong with my ears? What is going on here? Because there's supposed to be a sound coming from someplace whenever I pluck the string. The specific nature of that validation, though, tells you whether to tighten or loosen the string so that you can bring the pitch of that sound into alignment with other pitches so that the instrument is in tune and can play chords and harmonies and all sorts of more complex music. In the same way, receiving validation, whether it's positive or negative, allows us to figure out how to align ourselves with what's around us. When the validation isn't there, however, and there is still that inner integrity, that knowing that I've looked at it, I've measured it, I've double-checked, it really is correct. It's kind of like when I was trying to record some music into my computer once, and I didn't have speakers that would play the music back to me as I was playing it. I didn't have what was called a monitor, something that monitored the sound going into the computer. And since I couldn't hear the sounds, I had to remember what the sounds were like and play them as perfectly as I could imagine in my mind. And only after I had recorded them and stopped the recording could I go back and then play the recording and see if it sounded exactly the way it was supposed to, the way I had intended it to. But in those instances when I didn't have a speaker that could monitor the sound being recorded, I had to have faith that as I was pushing down the appropriate keys, that the right sounds were going into the computer so that I could record music for some of my songs. sometimes, even without validation, we have to still go forward. There have been times where, as Sister Hu, I found myself surrounded by people who were not particularly self-aware, or who found anything that was different, to be threatening, and consequently they would go out of their way to pretend that I wasn't there, to pretend that everything was normal, everything was fine, there was nothing unusual about a person in costume. And in so doing, they would make it abundantly clear that they weren't comfortable with addressing unfamiliar things, with interacting with people who were that different from themselves. And in some ways I felt sorry for them, and I respected that communication, that they were not ready to have a conversation with me. And I just said, well, thank you very much. I've got what I need. I'm leaving now. And if I was intended to talk to them, it would have to happen at a different time in a different context, because they made it clear that they were not in a place or a mindset to receive anything that I had to say at that point. And there wouldn't have been anything accomplished by me becoming more forceful about it. This is a theme that runs all through our world, though, because it's not just employers, it could be social gatherings also, and it could also be within a family. There are numerous people, myself included, I guess, who are estranged from their families because the families have certain expectations and requirements, without which they will not extend validation. It's almost as if they're saying, if you want to be a member of this family, you have to think like us, dress like us, act like us, be like us. And if a person looks in the mirror and honestly, looking in the mirror, reflecting on who they are on the inside, comes to the conclusion, but I'm not like any of you. And I don't understand how it is that we share the same genetic code, because in so many ways, I'm absolutely not like you. And then it becomes a question for them of whether to subvert who they really are in order to motivate that validation, to satisfy the expectations of family, in order to have those familiar relationships. In some places around the world, there are whole cultures built around that premise, that the family matters more than the individual, and no matter what you have to subvert in yourself, no matter how much you have to lie, it is more important to be a member of that family than it is to be yourself. I guess I'm kind of on the opposite side of that, insisting that whatever the individual finds within the individual self is what the divine intended to share with humanity. And if we subvert that for any reason whatsoever, be it satisfying a family or keeping a job, if we subvert who we are, there is something that cannot come to the world through any other means, that if it does not come through us, it will not come at all. It simply won't be there. And when you look at the scope of human history, that has some rather scary implications. What if there had never been an Alan Turing, a gay man in World War II who is credited with deciphering the code system that the Nazis used to communicate with their troops. And by deciphering that code system, the Allied forces were able to intercept Nazi communications and make more effective strategic decisions. If Alan Turing hadn't been there, if because he wasn't normal enough, because he was gay, because he was all sorts of things that weren't normal, that weren't typical, that weren't just like everyone else, it's because of those differences that he was able to do what he did and make that contribution to human history, which many have credited with altering the course of World War II. That if we had not been able to unravel that code, that it's questionable whether the war would have ended the way it did. Additionally, that first deciphering of the code and the system he created is also by some attributed with contributing to the development of modern computers. That there was something about the way information was processed and altered in each repetition that mechanically evolved into the basic sort of thinking that led to the invention of the computers. Our whole current technological age could all go back to that one domino, that if we changed that one piece, it's conceivable that we wouldn't even have computers today. One could hope that some other method would have been found, but it's conceivable that would have altered all of history simply by him not doing that one simple little thing at that one auspicious moment in time. Did he need the validation to do that? Well, not really, except that later it would have been really wonderful for that validation to be remembered. In this particular case, Alan Turing eventually committed suicide because at the time that he deciphered the Nazi code, he was given a medal for his contribution to the war effort, and regarded as a hero. Quite some years later, he was a gay man who was living in a homophobic society and was so oppressed and threatened and manipulated that he wound up committing suicide. And it was in going through his effects afterwards that they discovered that, this medal and putting the two together made no sense to the people at the time, that they could be so disapproving of someone who had been regarded as a major hero in World War II. So on one hand, I keep coming back to this point of saying that sometimes the validation doesn't matter. Sometimes you have to act according to your own internal integrity. And yet at other times, the validation can offer helpful information and a sense of whether you're on course or not. Every gauge and dial inside of a vehicle, be it an airplane, a car, or any other vehicle, provides validation of what is happening. When I'm driving down the highway in my car, the speedometer provides validation to tell me how fast I'm actually going. And then it is for my experience and training to tell me, as I'm approaching a curve, whether the speed on the dial is too much for that curve and whether I need to slow down in order to safely navigate the curve in the road. Without the validation of the accurate validation of the speed at which I'm traveling, I wouldn't know how to make a better decision. And I may come to that corner, that bend in the road at too great of a speed and lose control and have an accident, and possibly fatally so. So in one sense, yes, we do depend on the validation. On the other hand, we have to know when the validation is wrong. I grew up in southern Wisconsin because I was thinking I should do so at the first opportunity. I went through driver's ed in high school and learned how to drive a car, and then went to take my driver's test, and unfortunately it had snowed very heavily 2 or 3 days before my driver's test. So I'm out on the road trying to navigate around these snowbanks that are 5 feet high with this huge car, and occasionally there were icy patches or places where the snow hadn't been cleared enough, and I would attempt to accelerate, and the speedometer needle would go way up all of a sudden as the wheels spun. That was inaccurate validation. It was saying you're going 40 miles an hour, and I knew I wasn't going 5 miles an hour. I knew the wheels were spinning because I could hear the sound of the wheels spinning because the car itself wasn't moving. I knew because of that other information that the validation of the speedometer was wrong. And it's an important point, I think, with any source of validation to know that there are times when even the most well-intentioned report is in error. That there is no system of reporting, no gauge, no dial, no friend or loved one, no matter how much we would otherwise trust them, who is so infallible that something cannot produce a false reading or a false perception or something that's not understood accurately because of not knowing about something else that's going on. I spoke with a professor during my master's program when I was working on my master's degree, and she commented that her husband was diabetic and that she could tell when his blood sugar was low because his emotions would be affected and the clarity of his thoughts would be affected, such that she could tell, whether he had just taken his insulin or whether everything was in balance or whether his insulin was tapering off and it was time to get ready for the next dose. People who use medications for various conditions go through similar sorts of cycles, and if you don't know what else is going on, you won't know why they're behaving as they do or the ways that it affects their judgment. In a more negative sense, the obvious example would be someone who has had too much wine or beer to drink, that it alters perception. They think everything is absolutely fine, but people on the outside hear the slurred words, see the erratic movements, and know that what is happening inside their brain and what is happening outside of their body are not the same thing. Which I suppose is why I tend to avoid drugs and alcohol and so forth for myself, not because I have any judgment about it for those who enjoy such things, but because I want clarity and accuracy in my perceptions, that I don't want anything to affect my awareness of whether my hand really is moving the way I think it's moving, and my thoughts really are connecting clearly and connecting coherently, and whether my words are coming out with the clarity that I desire. I want to be understood. I want to enunciate clearly. If I'm not projecting enough, if I'm not being heard across the room, I want someone to tell me, I can't hear you, you need to speak louder. It's not a put down, it's not an insult, it's helpful information. All that being said, there are times when people don't want to hear what we have to say because it's too difficult to listen to, or it disagrees with some conclusion they've already made, or it pokes holes in their arguments. I would suggest that better to know about the holes in your arguments so that you can deal with them than to pretend they're not there and essentially become more and more known as someone who believes something that isn't actually true. Even strangers may care about us and want to help us. But if we're not listening to their validation, positive or negative, we won't know what it is they're perceiving. At the same time, there may be people who have expectations they want us to fulfill, and they may not care about whether or not what they're asking is congruent with who and what we are. They need to be loved, they need to be respected, but their report needs to be recognized as being in error. That where they think, with all the best intentions, you need to do it this way in order to get a positive response from people. For just a minor example, someone insisted that I needed to be willing to lie on my resume in order to get hired for a particular job. And I said, no, I won't make that choice because it means I would have to continue practicing that lie for as long as I was employed there. And at any point that they find out, I could be immediately terminated without any complaint because I had lied on the application by which they hired me. And so I choose not to do that. It's a complicated two-edged sword. Validation is nice, it's good, it can be helpful information, but if it's an erroneous report, we need to be able to distinguish that. We need to have ways that we can recognize that. And we need to understand that even when the validation doesn't come, when you know you're acting in accordance with love and wisdom, when you know you're doing the right thing is enough. You don't need somebody else's validation to make it enough. You don't need a dog training treat to know that what you're doing is the right thing. You don't need to be rewarded. You need to know that you did the right thing. And I do the right thing because that's who I am, and because I want to feel confident about signing my name to things. I want to know that what I have done is something I would be willing to sign my name to. In any case, I hope that the last half hour's comments have been helpful to you in your own understanding and embrace or lack of concern about validation. When it's who you are and it's what you need to do, don't wait for the validation. When the validation comes, listen, because it may help you to do even better. Thank you very much for watching.